This recording was never meant to be found. Not by scholars, not by historians, and certainly not by the public. It was said to be destroyed, on Jung's personal request, shortly before his death in 1961. But like so many things hidden in the shadows of history, it found a way to survive. According to multiple independent sources, this final session took place behind closed doors, with no official transcript, no students present, and no intention to publish. Not a lecture, not a manuscript, just Jung and a recorder. The original tape, still missing, but fragments remained. Scraps and notebooks, lines and margins, and most notably, memories. Memories of those few who claimed to hear the original session before it vanished. They called it Jung's reckoning. Not a conclusion, not a summation, but an unraveling of his own mind, his fears, and his view of what happens when we die. This was not the Carl Jung of textbooks, not the clean-cut founder of analytical psychology. This was an old man, staring at the end, confronting the thing he'd studied all his life, the unconscious, and asking it, "Are you there when I'm gone?" The following reconstruction is based on those fragments. What you are about to hear is a restoration of a voice that refused to disappear. This is not a scientific paper. This is not spiritual doctrine. It is something far more dangerous. It is a man of science speaking like a mystic in his final days. It didn't begin with theory, Jung allegedly said. It began with something I cannot explain. A dream. Or perhaps not a dream at all. He described a state between waking and sleep. But this time, it wasn't hypnagogic. It wasn't imagined. He knew, in his bones, that something had shifted. I was not in my body. I was above it, above the earth. But I was not floating. I was observing, as if the entire world was behind glass, and I had stepped outside the frame. There was no panic, no fear, only awareness. He said it felt like remembering something you didn't know you had forgotten. A return, not to childhood, but to something even earlier, to what he called the psychic source. I was no longer Carl Jung, he said, but I still was. I still had being, but not identity. I existed as presence, not as person. And then he said something that would shake even his closest students. What we call death is not departure. It is the remembering of the field. The field. He used this word again and again in the surviving notes. Not as a metaphor, not as poetic imagery, but as a structure beneath the structure. The place where the unconscious, the archetypes, and the soul all merge. It is not individual. It is shared. Thoughts in this space do not belong to me. They emerge. They interweave. They speak as one, not as noise, but as patterned silence. He described it as pre-language, but deeply intelligible. A realm where symbols breathe, where archetypes walk, and where the ego cannot follow. Only the self. He claimed to have seen the archetypes not as ideas, but as living presences. Beings as old as time, embedded in every human dream. He saw the old man, not wise, but ancient. The shadow, shifting, yet familiar. The anima, fluid, observing the divine child, silent, still. Each one, he said, approached him not with words, but with recognition. They did not test me, they showed me what I was made of. The light that sees from within. At the center of this field, he saw a light, not a tunnel, not a sun, a knowing light. The kind that looks through you, not at you. It asked me nothing, and yet I knew it asked everything. And then came the question, a phrase so simple, yet so profound. Are you ready to return? He never answered, at least not out loud. The next moment, he said, I awoke, and I was crying. Not from fear, not from loss, but from what he called the unbearable intimacy of being seen completely. We do not encounter death for the first time when our heart stops, Jung said. We encounter it the first time we realize our story will end. For Jung, death was never a medical event. It was a psychological transformation, a sacred passage, not an erasure, but an initiation. There is an archetype of death, he wrote, and it waits within every man and woman, not to take them, but to prepare them. He believed that as we age, something begins to crack inside the ego, like a shell we once mistook for the whole creature. Through those cracks, light leaks in, and that light, it isn't always comforting. Sometimes it blinds. In this final interview, Jung allegedly described a series of psychic peelings, layers of self stripped away, not by force, but by realization. The role of parent peeled, the role of citizen peeled, the identity of success, failure, gender, nationality peeled. What remained? Something ancient, something silent, something that had never been those masks to begin with. Death is not the stripping away of who you are, he said. It is the stripping away of who you never were. And beneath it, a gaze. Your own. Unfiltered. Unmasked. Jung described death not as a monster in the dark, but as a mirror in the silence. A mirror that shows you everything you carried, and everything you can no longer take with you. He spoke of death the way some speak of enlightenment, as something that cannot be understood from the outside. You do not observe death, he said. You cross it. And in that crossing, he claimed, the mind does not vanish. It expands. But in a different geometry. Time folds, memory disperses, narrative collapses. He called this state the witness, not the ego, not the name, but the one who is seen, and now sees without needing to define. After death, the ego dissolves, but the witness remains, the I without history, without fear. Pure awareness, observing the story, even after the book is closed. Jung did not speak of reincarnation in the traditional sense. In fact, he disliked the term, too linear, too defined. Instead, he spoke of recurrence, of unfinished resonance, of souls who echo back into the field, not to relive, but to complete. Some return not out of punishment, but out of promise, he said, out of love, out of devotion, to light a path for others. He shared the story of a widow who dreamed of her deceased husband. In the dream, he stood at the window and whispered, "I will return near you. Not soon, and not like this, but you will know." She asked how. He pointed to her stomach and smiled. "I'll be born behind your eyes, not as a man, but as a memory." Jung called this the archetype of return. The soul that comes not to escape, but to complete what was left open, to carry a message, to offer a lesson, to remind others of what cannot be taught, only remembered. Perhaps most haunting of all was Jung's reflection on life itself. We are not born blank, he said. We are born remembering. But the noise of the world makes us forget. He believed that children, especially very young ones, often speak in what he called pre-incarnate echoes. I came from the stars. I chose you, Mommy. I'm not new. I'm back. To adults, these were fairy tales. To Jung, they were fragments. The psyche has no age, he wrote, only depth. And so he came to a final conclusion, whispered only once, at the very end of the interview. The question is not what happens when we die. The question is what happens when we remember who we were before we lived. After this, Jung said, you don't live. You serve. You don't seek meaning. You become it. In the last years of his life, Carl Jung began to speak less, not because he had nothing left to say, but because the words that came to him felt like echoes from somewhere else. His students noticed. He no longer looked at people, he looked through them. "You speak not to who they are," he told one student, "but to who they forgot they were." In one of the final alleged fragments of the suppressed interview, Jung recounted a peculiar experience. He had been ill, not dangerously so, just enough to pull him into sleep more often. But one night, he said, the sleep felt different. "I felt pushed back," he said, "like something wanted me to stay. But something else, something far greater, told me, you're not done." When he opened his eyes the next morning, the room looked the same, but he did not feel the same. He described it like stepping back into a dream, only this time he was the dreamer. And in that dream, this reality, he now had a mission, not to live for himself, but to become a message, to live as a remembering. Jung said that what he witnessed in that in-between state taught him one devastating truth. We forget not because we lose the truth, but because the world gets too loud. And the soul? The soul doesn't shout. It whispers. It speaks in silence. He called this silence the soul's native tongue. And he believed that most adults become deaf to it, not because they're incapable, but because they've been trained to ignore it. Children, however, they still hear it. "I've seen children speak in tongues they've never been taught," he said. "Not the language of nations, but the language of stars, of symbols, of archetypes." He collected stories, not scientific, but deeply human, of children saying things no adult could explain. "Before I came here, I was a bird. I used to be old, but then I chose to come back. When I die again, can I be your dad next time?" Jung didn't laugh at these stories. He wept for them, because to him, they weren't funny. They were holy. "The child remembers the light," he said. "And slowly, we teach them to forget." To bridge the silence, Jung turned to symbols. He believed that symbols were the closest approximation to the language of the soul. Not logical, not linear, but layered, like dreams. "Dreams are the forgotten letters of the soul," he said. "When they speak to you, listen, not with your mind, but with your memory." He believed dreams, symbols, visions, all of these were ways the soul tried to remind us of something lost. Not facts, but truths. The truth that you are more than your name. The truth that time is not your master. The truth that this life is not your first, nor your last. And the greatest symbol? Jung said it was the light. But not just any light. A knowing light. Jung described this light in a way that startled even his closest colleagues. "It does not shine," he said. "It sees. It is not a light that reveals surfaces. It is a light that pierces through them. A light that does not judge, but knows. And when it looks at you, it sees everything. Not your mistakes, not your achievements, but the part of you that was never either. And when it sees you, truly sees you, it asks only one question. Do you remember?" Jung believed this question was not rhetorical. It was literal. And it could be answered in many ways. Through a tear, through a dream, through an ache that has no name but feels like coming home. When people say they fear death, he said, they often mean they fear being forgotten. But what if what we really fear is forgetting ourselves? According to the transcript, the interview ended abruptly. Jung sat quietly. He had spoken for over an hour, about dreams, death, the soul, the light. And then he looked directly into the camera, not like a man being recorded, but like someone who had just seen what lies behind the curtain. And he said, I do not fear death. I fear forgetting who I was. Not as a man, but as a light. If you made it to the end, it wasn't by chance. Maybe something inside you remembers. Leave a comment. I remember the light. And if you're ready to go further, the next video is unlike anything we've shown. Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet, left behind the most detailed records of the soul's journey after death. You'll hear what happens the moment we die, the realms beyond the veil, and why some souls return and others do not.